We will start with the diversity update from Anna Lyons from our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and then I'll introduce the speaker. Anna.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so just going to give a quick update. We've had a lot of events going on this month. We kicked off the month with our town hall, where the committee kind of presented our preliminary results from the climate survey that was sent out to the department earlier this year. And we also, Roya has been kind of spearheading these First Friday workshops, and we started those this month as well, at the beginning of this month. And the first session went great, and I just want to encourage everyone here to, if you didn't come, come to the next one. If you did come, keep coming to them, and encourage everyone, your colleagues, your students, to come as well, because we really want to get as much participation as possible. I'm going to paste in the chat the 2 registration links for, there's the morning and the afternoon session. The next session is happening on November 6th, which is another Friday. And the 2 sessions are exactly the same, but just pick which time is best for you. And then also at the town hall, we introduced a way for the community to sign up for volunteer activities to kind of get involved in diversity and inclusion work in the department. So I will also paste the link for the form. So if you haven't gotten a chance to look at what sorts of activities you get involved in, you can take a look at that link. And then some other upcoming events that we have, there's going to be the Graduate Diversity Fair on October 22nd. The deadline to nominate President and Chancellor postdocs is coming up November 1st, so I encourage faculty to do that. Also encourage graduate applications, which the deadline is December 15th. And also any applicants please encourage people to apply to the 2 faculty searches that we have open. And then one last thing is, another fun thing that's coming up is we have registration open to participate in the screening of Picture a Scientist, which is kind of this documentary following the lives of 3 women scientists earlier in the 20th century, and just kind of an examination of their experience. So I will paste that link in the chat as well. And yeah, those are my updates. I'll hand it over.
Thank you, Anna. So let me introduce our speaker. Alex Rudolph is a professor of physics and astronomy at Cal State Polytechnic University at Pomona. Professor Rudolph's research is in 2 areas. First is radio and infrared astrophysics. He studies star and planetary system formation, galactic molecular clouds and H2 regions, young stars, searches for brown dwarfs, galactic structure and evolution, and more. I discovered that Alex also has a Berkeley connection. While his PhD is from the University of Chicago, he had a co-advisor, William Welch, who was the director of the radio astronomy lab at UC Berkeley. Professor Rudolph's second area of research, and the one he will tell us about today, is astronomy and physics education and best practices to increase access for traditionally underrepresented groups in physics and astronomy. He is the director of CalBridge, which runs the acclaimed CalBridge Scholars Program, and it offers support and mentoring for CSU students. This is a program that our own astronomy and physics departments are proud to be involved with as mentors. In addition, Professor Rudolph also leads the Compare Summer Research Program, which is a network of Cal State universities and community colleges. And Professor Rudolph has also kindly agreed to meet with our graduate admissions committee and talk to them separately about best practices. and also meet with students only tomorrow at 4:30, and a message about that was sent. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rudolph, and I'll mute myself and let Alex talk.
Thank you, Ori, for that very kind introduction. So I'm not quite sure why, but I think either because of the pandemic and people are just more able to come, or if it's because of this increased interest in diversity and equity and inclusion, but I don't think I've ever had 73 people at a colloquium before, so this is great. I really welcome all of you. So as Ori said, I'm going to talk a little bit today about overcoming barriers to engagement of underrepresented students in STEM PhD programs. And let me start by just introducing some data that may be familiar to some of you, but I wanted to share it so we can set the stage. As most of us know, physics and astronomy is extremely undiverse. Women make up only about 20% of PhDs, and similar numbers exist in computer science and computer engineering, which I mention only because we're starting a pilot program in those fields this year. Up till now, we've been only doing physics and astronomy. And Black, Hispanic, and Native Americans, those who are considered underrepresented minorities, are over 30% of the population, but only 6% of PhDs in physics and astronomy, and only 10% in these other related fields. And in general, the physical sciences are very, very underrepresented in both numbers of women and numbers of underrepresented minorities. So this is kind of the problem. So let me talk a little bit about the outline of what I'm going to say. So what I want to do is have two parts to the talk. The first part I'm going to talk about just generally, what are the barriers to diversity in STEM? And it's not going to be exhaustive, of course, because there's a lot to be said here and I have a limited time. So I'm going to try to hit a few highlights of some things that I think are really central to why we have such a lack of diversity in STEM. And some of these relate to our society as a whole and the structural racism that we all are grappling with these days. And then I'll talk a little bit about the CalBridge program and how it's trying to address these issues a bit. I think that traditionally people leave questions till the end or chat them, and then Ori will ask them at the end. But if there's something really pressing that somebody wants to talk about in the middle, I'm okay with somebody jumping in if they have a really burning question. So what are the barriers to diversity in STEM PhD programs? So I want to call your attention to an incredibly important book by Julie Posselt of USC, which is called Inside Graduate Admissions, Merit, Diversity, and Faculty Gatekeeping. This was a very eye-opening book for me. I have become, Dr. Posselt is a collaborator now in the CalBridge project doing research with us into related topics around the program. But what she did was she did a comparative ethnographic case study where she was a PhD admissions. And she sat in on the meetings of 10 PhD programs at 3 public and private universities that included among them physics and astronomy, both separately. Was able to sit through, was allowed to be basically present during the entire discussion that takes place in the selection process, and then did a number of interviews with professors and some graduate students afterwards to kind of fill out the picture of what was going on in those meetings. And she came up with some very interesting conclusions from this study. In particular, she found the biggest barrier is risk aversion. And that's really understandable, and even because when you take a graduate student into your program, you're committing to 5 or 6 years of usually many programs to commit to full support, and it will take you many tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to train them. If somebody fails in that process, it's very costly for the university, right? It's not a small thing. And in terms of numbers, one person out of the number that you admit is actually not a small thing, or a couple. So there's a tendency to want to minimize risk. But the main thing is she found is that people's assumptions about what is risky are usually untested, are not very well tested. So we'll come back to the risk aversion in a bit. The second one is conflict aversion. So you're in a committee meeting and everybody, these are your colleagues who've been your colleagues for years, maybe decades, or going to be your colleagues for years, maybe decades. People don't want to have big arguments and fights over things in committees. So there's a tendency to, and race and gender and difficult cases, what might seem like difficult cases to work on, can create conflict or create stress, tension. So there's a tendency to maybe sheer away from those topics. This is what she found, is that people will avoid those topics a bit and try not to talk about them. And then there's something called homophily, which is a term I learned, which is basically a sociological term, which is very simple. It means people have preferences for people like themselves. And that can mean a lot of, and it's natural and normal. So the fact that if you're white, you might have a natural tendency to feel more comfortable with white people is not necessarily a sign of racism, but rather just naturally human tendency that we tend to like people like ourselves. But it also refers to people like, if you went to Harvard for your PhD, you'll tend to feel an affinity for people who went to Harvard for their PhD. So there's that tendency to like that as well. And then finally, there's the GRE and what people think it means and what it actually means in terms of people's potential for success in programs. So following up on that work, and also just to try to address this general problem, the American Astronomical Society, which I'm a member, convened a task force, a national task force, to look at questions of what caused, what are some steps that departments could take towards diversity and inclusion in their departments. And they, and I co-chaired that I co-chaired that with one of your colleagues from astronomy, Gabor Basri, who I think is here. He and I co-chaired this task force, along with a variety of people from across the country, graduate students, senior faculty, more junior faculty. We also had 3 social scientists, including Dr. Posselt, who advised us on what are the best practices and what is known in the literature about best practices. And the purpose of this task force was to create practical steps that a department can take to implement its recommendations. So if you're interested in looking at this report, it's about astronomy nominally, but as you can imagine, there's very little difference between what the astronomers and physicists are looking for in graduate students. And in addition to the main recommendations, there's a huge appendix, a set of appendices full of specific, actionable, usable materials that you can use to improve the practices in your department. So what we looked at was really around 3 big areas. We were looking at recruitment, admissions, and retention. That was our 3 big things we wanted to look at. And we tried to develop a development of a statement of these best practices. The AAS Board of Trustees did, in fact, adopt this and endorse them. And as I said, the report is now available to be downloaded and read freely if you like. I'm going to focus now on admissions because that's the one that's easiest to talk about and that's the most sort of central in people's minds. But I just want to say that retention and the way that people mentor and the inclusion of the department is a very big topic worth looking at. And I won't have time to go into the details of what the report says, but I encourage you to look at it. So holistic admissions is the term that's used most commonly to refer to getting away from a very numerical kind of formulaic approach to admissions, which admittedly nobody uses a purely formulaic approach. It's nothing like you look at their grades, you look at their GRE, and then they're either in or out. Obviously that's not true. There's letters, essays, and so forth. But the weight of those numerical quantities and other related quantities like reputation of the letter writers, reputation of the school the students go to are things that have been heavily weighted in the past. And to get away from that, the emphasis is on something called holistic admissions. And holistic admissions, the recommendations of the task force were the holistic admissions should have 3 main characteristics. It should be comprehensive, meaning that beyond those things I mentioned, looking at qualities like socio-emotional competencies, some of which are listed here, which have been shown by a significant amount of research to be very highly correlated with success in things like research and graduate school. These things can be measured. They're not easy to measure, but they can be measured, and they are worth measuring if you're trying to improve the level of diversity in your department. Systematic. Traditionally, a lot of times, each person reads the application and comes up with a score, 1, 2, or 3, or A, B, or C, or 1 through 5, or whatever, totally independently of everyone else, with no guidance as to what constitutes those numbers, which means that when you're comparing one person's 5 to another person's 3, you don't really know what you're comparing. It's actually considered very best practice to create rubrics of what are you looking at. And this has to be something developed by the department that everyone wants to feel like, yes, this is what we care about. This is how we weight different factors so we know what matters to us as a group. People are still free to score those how they like, but at least you have a common ground to talk about it. And then contextualize, meaning there's a tendency to believe that the best students are the ones who've accomplished the most before they arrive. They have published papers as an undergrad, they've gone to conferences, they've done research over the summer, they speak very clearly and eloquently about what they do. They clearly have a lot of familiarity with what it means to be a scientist. And that's not bad. It's obviously good, in fact, but a lot of times you're missing the possibility for students who have a lot of potential to learn those things and grow in your program rather than just come in fully formed or relatively fully formed. So looking at potential as opposed and what trajectory they might have as opposed to just where they've been, not just accomplishment, but a potential. So the recommendations were to reduce reliance on standardized tests. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Try to structure information. There are ways to structure information about recommendation letters, which again, I won't have time to go into, but is in the report. And also incorporate some assessment of these socio-emotional competencies. And then just a general piece of advice is that the reviewers and the committee should approach the students as learners, not just for what they've done, but what can they learn? Are they someone who would learn? And then recognize that the opportunities to learn and conduct research, to learn about the ethos of the scientific world varies considerably based on social privilege. I went to a small liberal arts college, Haverford College. Many of you probably know it. It's a pretty prestigious small liberal arts college. I had aunts and uncles who were PhDs. I knew a lot about academia and how one got into it. So I had a big advantage over those like my students now in the CSU who don't. And what I want to do is that leads me into a topic that I want to talk a bit about, I'm going to come back to later, called the myth of meritocracy. So now I'm just going to first turn and talk about the standardized test question for a moment. So you may have heard this before. It's become quite a common topic in talks like this. In fact, I was just talking with Ori about the fact that your dean, who was formerly the chair, there was a sort of a apocryphal study she had done with others about your department, showing that there was not a correlation between the GRE score and success. These are some more general numbers that have been out there. So this is first of all showing what does correlate with the GRE, which is first of all gender. So this is a plot of the fraction of students who scored above a certain score on the GRE, and it shows men and women. And 650 is a traditional kind of 40th percentile kind of cutoff, or where people start to feel nervous about scores below that sometimes. And you see that at that cutoff, half the men make it through, but only a quarter of the women. So right away, you've cut out a significant number of women from your consideration at this point, even if you're using it as a sort of a light cut. And then if you compare that to race and ethnicity, it's also very striking. This is known about standardized tests in general. And in fact, as you all know, the UC and the CSU have abandoned this SAT in the coming years, partly because of things like this. Now, the question is, what does the GRE correlate with? Is it useful for anything? And the main thing people look at, the correlations that do exist are around first-year grades are modestly correlated with the GRE's physics GRE, and success in passing a very rigorous qualifying exam can be moderately, but only moderately, correlated. So people with low scores do pass. It's not a perfect predictor, so it's very dangerous to use that as a reason. But what it doesn't correlate with is what we really should be caring about, which is, do they finish their PhD? Are they successful? So there was a study came out last year that actually looked at physics GRE students, over 2,000 students over a 10-year period, and looked at their GRE physics scores. And that's what's on the very right. And on the x-axis, you can see that they had scores ranging all the way from 10th to 90th percentile. So there was no problem with range in this, in the domain of this study. And on the y-axis is the probability of PhD completion. The other grades, the other undergraduate grade point average, the quantitative GRE, and the verbal GRE. And what they found is there is no statistically significant relationship in either the verbal or the physics GRE score. And that's important because the verbal score has often been pointed to as something that people claim does correlate, but it actually doesn't. The quantitative score has a very mild correlation with a very p-value barely below 0.05, so barely statistically significant. And the important thing to realize here is that even if you take that at face value, the difference between the probability of somebody with a 10th percentile score and a 90th percentile score on this quantitative test finishing their PhD differs by only 8%. So it's a tiny little effect with almost no statistical significance. So overall, the message is the GRE does not predict likelihood to finish the PhD. Now I have a lot of other data, but because of time, I'm going to have to just skip over it, and I'm happy to talk about it. But there's lots of studies that show that the GRE is not a good predictor of success in grad school. The other problem is it's expensive, right? It costs $200 for the general GRE, $150 for the physics GRE. You got to pay $27 to report the scores after your first 4. Many students take it more than once because they don't do well enough, they think, in the first try, so they take it 2, maybe even 3 times each test. It can add up to between $500 and even a couple $1,000s by the time they're done. And if they don't get into grad school, that's all money wasted. And believe me, $2,000, even $500 is a huge amount of money to some of the students in our program who are on very significant financial aid because they don't have enough money to go to school. So in a way, the message I'm starting to want to get across is that what are sometimes traditionally called diversity programs like CalBridge are really equal opportunity programs. They're trying to balance some of the intrinsic advantages society gives to the majority groups. And so that leads me to my next topic, which is the meritocracy myth. So what does that mean? Well, there's actually, and then I'm going to talk about the role of privilege in our society. Those are the 2 big topics around this topic. So first off, I'm going to talk about the meritocracy myth, which is actually a book. There's a lot of books on this topic, but this is one I like that I, again, recommend you read if you want to know more about this. But the basic idea is this. The myth is that each individual in life achieves success based entirely 100% on merit. So if you are successful and got to be a grad student in physics or a professor of physics or a rich person who's got a very successful business, that's 100% entirely due to your own merit, your own abilities. And that we hear that a lot in our society. That's a very American thing. And in the book, and I'll say in the book, they talk about the origins of this idea, this myth, from really from Calvinistic society. The reality is that many factors can affect your success, including merit. Merit is not unimportant, clearly, but other things like social status, your race and ethnicity, your heritage, and your wealth can have a big impact as well. So for example, the single biggest determinant of where someone ends up in the economic pecking order is where they started. What your parents' wealth is the best predictor of what your level of wealth will be, your economic success. Inheritance, and I don't just mean money here, you can inherit a lot of things from your parents, but inheritance from your parents and from your family and the so-called staggered start play a role. You inherit your starting point from your parents, and the staggered start refers to this idea as imagine a race where everyone's going to race around around the track, but instead of everyone starting at the same place, some people start at one place and other people start behind by different amounts. It's a little like the handicapping in golf, except in this case, you're not handicapping for advantages, you're handicapping against disadvantages. So people who don't have as many advantages will be starting from behind and will have to work that much harder to catch up and get ahead. So for example, money, educational opportunity, connections, all help insulate against failure. So if you have a child of a wealthy or even middle-class family who has a drug problem, they can afford to get into rehab, they can be hopefully gotten better and continue on with their life and be okay. If you're from a low socioeconomic background and you have that same problem, you may not have those resources, that failure may be it for you. You may be pushed onto a track that you'll never get out of. So those of us with privilege have ways to not just have advantages, but also get insulated against failure. Also, people with more money have better health in this country, as sad as that may be. Education can help, but it doesn't always. And we can't just treat education as the perfect panacea, which is sometimes what people say as well. If you just get an education, you can do whatever you want. That's not entirely true. So for example, think about this, the bribery scandal on college admissions. People were shocked to discover that, wow, wealthy people have an advantage in admissions, really? But anybody who was involved in it knew that was the case. It was very clear that there's many, many ways, not just by buying your way in, but even by having money to pay for an SAT prep class or a GRE, things of that nature. So in general, society benefit, and the fact that schools from wealthier communities, because K through 12 education is paid by property taxes, wealthier communities have better schools. So it goes all the way back to the beginning. So that's what I want to say about the meritocracy myth. Now I want to talk about privilege and this idea that what is privilege? And this is a very important topic. Some of you may have heard what I'm about to say, but it's a very misunderstood topic. And even now, it's a topic that creates a lot of resentment among some people for understandable reasons, because they're in fact misunderstanding what's meant by it. So what do we mean? What do we mean when we say I have male privilege or I have white privilege? You know, what do I mean by that? Do I mean that all white people and all men are rich or have it easy? That if you're white, you have it easy in this world? No, that's not what we mean at all. So the fact that there are people who don't have, you know, who are struggling but are white or men is consistent with this. So what does it mean? Well, the best way I found to explain this is to consider something like height, because height's something everyone understands and knows about. So if you're tall, I'm reasonably tall, I'm not terribly tall, but I'm 6 feet, my wife's only 5 feet. If we go to the grocery store, she cannot reach anything on the top shelf and I can. So if somebody needs to get something off the top shelf, I'm gonna get it, not her. Even if I had arthritis and couldn't really stretch my arm up above my head, or if I was in a wheelchair, I would still have that intrinsic height that in general gives someone an advantage. Even if I personally can't take advantage of it, it's still a truth that I'm tall. And not every tall person is better off in every way than every short person. My wife, you know, likes to point out that, you know, she's less likely to bonk her head on something as she walks around. So, you know, it's not like it's all one way, but there are certain advantages to being tall. And on average, I think most people would agree that being tall has certain advantages. So if you're tall and you're with a short person who comes by and asks you for help on the top shelf, you'll try to reach up and get it for them, right? Because that's what you do. You try to help people who don't have something you have, an advantage you have. Well, that's exactly the way to think about these different things: white privilege, male privilege, being straight or cisgendered, able-bodied. Each of these groups has advantages that come with being a member of that group. That doesn't mean that there aren't poor, disadvantaged, white, straight, cisgendered, able-bodied men. There are. You can have many things happening in your life that aren't helpful. But someone with those disadvantages who's white will have an easier time than someone who's black in similar circumstances. The obvious example is being stopped by the police. Everybody knows this now, but you know, if you're stopped by the police, I have never felt nervous when I was stopped by the police that they were going to take my life or even assault me or even threaten me. It just never occurred to me at all. If you're black, it's very much on your mind. In fact, there's videos that people make, you know, of if you're black, you have to have a talk with your children. They call it the talk at some point to explain to them that they need to be wary of strangers and police who might not have good intentions towards them just because they're black. And having more than one, being from more than one non-privileged group is often the hardest. That's this idea of intersectionality. So if you're both black and lesbian, or if you're a black and woman and a lesbian, that's, you know, or black and gay or whatever, then you have multiple disadvantages, and that's even harder. So just like a tall person helps a short person reach a higher shelf, those with privilege should strive to help those who don't have the same privileges, and should accept that correcting for those privileges that are built into our society is not discrimination, right? Loss of privilege is not discrimination. And that's the big argument. Like, I don't know if you've all voted. I'm going to say something political, which maybe I shouldn't, but Prop 16, which would get rid of Prop 209, which forbids us from considering race and those things in admissions and other hiring, this idea of being colorblind is a false premise, because colorblind means that you're ignoring the existence of privilege, and things that give advantages or even try to counteract those privileges are just trying to right the wrongs that exist. And visually, this cartoon captures it well. So equality is everyone gets the same thing. This is Prop 209, right? But as you can see, not everybody, this is again the height, not everybody can benefit from it in the same way. Equity, which is one thing we strive for, is okay, let's give the short person an extra box so they can see over the fence and watch the game. Social justice is, of course, when you can get rid of the fence entirely and everyone just sees, and that's the goal ultimately, is that you would get rid of all the barriers. So the key takeaways from this part of the talk are: admissions processes, both graduate and undergraduate, are not simple decisions about merit or ability. There's no way you can simply judge who is the most meritorious, who's second, who's third in any meaningful way. What you can do is you can make relative judgments. This group is the most meritorious. This group is in the middle of the pack. This group is not probably ready to come into the Berkeley Physics PhD program. And then the question is, within that top group, how do you select the ones you actually take? Because even that top group is much bigger than you can admit. And how much can you or should you invoke some of these other characteristics we're talking about. The second is that merit is not the fact that merit is not a simply measured quantity is one of the biggest barriers to equity in higher education. And standardized tests have been shown to introduce discrimination into the system. What I like to say about the GRE is if no one had ever heard of the GRE, and I said to you, hey, I've got this great test. It's numerical, so it's really easy to use, and you will be able to use that score to kind of maybe tell roughly who's going to do well in the first year classes and pass the qual, but it'll have nothing to do with whether they're a good scientist or whether they'll get their PhD. Oh, and by the way, it'll definitely discriminate heavily against groups that non-white male groups. Wouldn't you like to use that? And you'd say, no, that's a terrible idea. We're not going to do that. So, okay. So that's the end of this part of the talk. I don't know if we want to pause here or just go through the rest of it for any questions, or just go on to talk about CalBridge at this point. What do you think, Ori? Should we keep going?
Let's see if anybody wants to ask a question via chat, or I suppose just unmute.
They can save it to if you want to save it to the end, that's fine. Okay.
I don't see anything on chat. So
okay. All right. Well, I'll keep going, and then people can hopefully.
Oh, I think Barbara. Oh, excuse me, Barbara Yatsek.
I did actually raise my hand. Maybe the next section you're going to talk about will answer my question, but I was very intrigued by the topic that I believe you called retention. My husband's a lawyer, and I happened to listen in this morning on a phone conference they had about diversity in their large international law firm. And they spent a lot of time talking about, what are they going to do to make the more diverse candidates successful in the firm? And I was wondering if you have some sort of summary. Are there a couple takeaway points on that?
Unfortunately, no, but there are resources. So let me I don't want to dodge the question, but I don't think there's a simple couple of two things you can do, or here are the top two things to do. I will, okay. So if you, first of all, I wasn't planning on talking about retention so much in this talk, only because CalBridge is about getting students into the PhD program, although we're happy to work with PhD programs to help improve retention once they get in. I think one thing is doing a better job of admissions, and by that I mean looking for these types of students who have these socio-emotional competencies will help, because they'll be more capable of managing and doing well and succeeding. And that does, in fact, if you do that, that will diversify your PhD pool, because those are things that are much more evenly spread across the different groups when coupled with, other things like grades and things you need to think about. The AAS report has an entire section on this. And the one thing I'll just say, the number one recommendation on that topic is the entire department coming together and doing a very serious level of self-reflection. And that doesn't sound like a very concrete thing to do, but and I should say that the report has specific topics you should talk about in that process, and tools to help you do a good job of talking about that. But really, it's just saying you need to have a conversation sounds like your husband's firm is having, about how to do that. And it's going to be multifaceted, and it's going to require some very heavy self-reflection. Now, I heard from Anna that you're doing a climate survey, and that's a huge start. That's a great start, because if it's a real anonymous, carefully done climate survey, it can give you a lot of, and it's taken very seriously, it can give you a lot of information. So that's all I can really say at this point. But I think if you take a look at this report, you'd find a lot there on that topic. Okay, so let me go on and talk about CalBridge. I think I've got about 15 minutes maybe, or 10, 15 minutes left, which is this multi-institutional partnership. So what is CalBridge? So here's a map to kind of give you a visual. Basically, it's a partnership of 16 CSUs and 9 UCs, including Berkeley. All 11 physics and astronomy departments are involved at those 9 UCs. And we have over 250 faculty involved across all those universities. We also have 30 community colleges from which we recruit into the CSU. And the goal is to try to help increase the number of underrepresented undergraduates from the CSU to get into PhD programs in physics, astronomy, and now we're adding computer science and computer engineering. And eventually we hope to expand this into other STEM fields as well. But today I'm talking just about physics and astronomy. So we've broken it up into 2 regions, just for reasons to do with geography. Before COVID, we used to have a lot of activities that took place in person. So we would get all the scholars from across Northern California together, or Southern California together for workshops. I think we had a workshop hosted at Berkeley last year where they get a chance to come be on the campus and both be delivered some material for professional development, but also see a UC campus. They usually get to meet grad students or even faculty and kind of get a feel for what the campus, it's like a little mini visit day. So we have these two regional groups, but they run exactly the same in parallel. The mission, I already said it, is to increase the number of underrepresented students getting into these PhD programs, and we call the students who are in the program CalBridge Scholars. So the basic idea of what it is, there's 4 pillars, we call them, of support that we give them. Most important is they get multiple engaged mentors, and by engaged mentors, we mean that each scholar from a CSU gets a Cal State faculty member as a mentor and a UC faculty member as a mentor. And the primary way that the UCs are involved in this program is by acting as mentors. So every single scholar has a mentor from a UC, and a number of your colleagues in physics and astronomy are mentors. Ori is a mentor, and a lot of others as well. Gabor is a mentor, and so forth. And those mentors meet with them twice every month, every other week at least, and they're there to give them real complete 360-degree mentorship. That is, they talk about, it's not really about research, it's about navigating the world of academia, just being a good student, getting good grades in their undergrad classes, helping them if they need it there, and then guiding them through the process of trying to get to successfully applying to PhD programs. So helping them through writing their grad essay, how to pick the schools to apply to, finding research opportunities, all of those things, as well as just life things if they have questions, or if they're having mental health or physical health issues, helping them through all of that. The mentoring is the most valued piece of this program by the scholars. Secondly, we do give them scholarships of up to $10,000 per year for 2 years. It's a 3-year program that supports them for their last 2 years of undergraduate and the first year of grad school if they go to a UC. And they get up to $10,000 per year for those 3 years. And this allows them as an undergrad to cut their workload down. We actually require them as part of a contract to work less than 10 hours a week so that they can focus on school, because Cal State students, their average family income is about $45,000. More than half get Pell Grants or Cal Grants, and many of them work 20 or 30 or even 40 hours a week to put themselves through school. They can get a Cal Grant, which will cover their tuition, but they still have to pay for their living expenses. And so many of them have to work to cover that. By giving them this money, we're asking them to stop working very much so they can focus on school. The third is professional development workshops. So I mentioned that there are these workshops we run on things, everything from imposter syndrome or growth mindset or other socio-emotional competencies to life as a PhD student, how to write a grad essay. We do a little Python programming with them, a whole variety of different things to help them. But the preparation for writing a grad essay is probably one of the most important ones. And as I said, when we were in person, we would rotate through the UC so that each UC might get a visit over the 2 years from this group of students who are very interested and possibly might want to come to your program. That's not possible right now, but that's something we hope to return to at some point. And then lastly, we help them find summer research experiences. And although I won't talk about it in any detail, Ori sort of mentioned we have this summer research program that's actually going into its 12th year called Compare. And just briefly, it's a program in which students can apply from all the CSUs and about 30 community colleges, so over 50 or 60 universities around the state. They can all apply with one application to anywhere from 15 to 20 or more research opportunities across the country. So different research REUs and other programs work with us to let us place their students with them. And we're working on trying to make that happen in physics for Berkeley next summer. So depending on how that goes, we may have some students with you next summer. And I mention that specifically because the programs they go to are all over the place, including some REUs and some schools all over the place. But we do have a number of UCs, and having a chance for the students to come work for a UC, be there for the summer, can be a really beneficial thing, both for you guys to sell them on the program and recruit them, and for them to try to impress you and convince you that they'd be a good fit in your program. So it's something we'd like to do a lot more of, is place a lot more of these students at UCs. So how are we doing? Well, up to this date, we had 127 scholars total, and 90% of them are in graduate school after graduating with a bachelor's. 2/3 or so, a little over 2/3 are going straight to a PhD program, and the rest are going into a master's, but will be reapplying to PhD programs. And you can see that we've got 2/3 first-generation students, 2/3 underrepresented minorities, not quite half women, but we do have almost 1/4 of our students are underrepresented minority women. And as you heard me say, those are groups, these intersectional groups are ones that really struggle. You know, if only 20% of women get into graduate PhD programs in physics and only 6% of, or 8% of underrepresented minorities, you know, you can do the math and see how low it's going to be. And then we're about 20% LGBTQ plus. So we feel like we have a nice diverse group, and we have a couple pictures to show how diverse they are. So basically, this just shows the breakdown in the sort of pie chart mode. And what I want you to focus on, and don't worry that it says 129, I haven't updated, it's really 127. But what I want to focus on is you'll see that of the 61 with a bachelor's degree, 38, that's 62% have gone straight to PhD, 25% to the master's. And then I just want you to see that of the 38 who are in PhD programs, almost just under 40% are at UCs right now. We'd like that to be more like 50%. We know it can't be 100% because, for one thing, there probably aren't enough positions in all, even if you allow for all the UCs, there probably aren't enough positions across the whole state to take them all, and they don't all necessarily qualify or wouldn't make it into your program. But here's where they are getting in, and you can see the UCs at the end in orange, and they're getting into some pretty good places. You know, you can read it yourself, but you can see Harvard, MIT, Ohio State, Princeton, University of Arizona, University of Chicago, and so on. So they're doing quite well. Actually, Caltech is on there too. So we think, you know, we're very happy with how well we're doing, and you'll note the asterisk at the bottom. We've had 9. We have all of them apply for an NSF GRFP. 9 of them have won over the 6 years they've applied. And another 4 have received an honorable mention. So we've actually had a lot of success getting them NSFs as well. And here's just a map showing visually that they really are spread out across the country, with obviously a fairly big concentration in California. And the orange is the PhD candidates, and the sort of maroon is the master's candidates. But as I say, some of those are going to be applying to graduate PhD programs this fall, in fact. We have, in addition to the UCs that we work with, all the UCs are considered partners, although they're not all equally engaged, and we would hope to get all of them more engaged, including Berkeley Physics, which I think we're working on with both your chair and your admissions committee. But not all students can or will attend a PhD program in a UC, so we've actually started recruiting partners that want to work with us to be part of the sort of our broader program. So the schools shown here, most of which who have already accepted one of our scholars or more, agree to certain conditions about how they'll treat their applications, in terms of just giving them no guarantees, but a really close look, a very careful look. They won't be filtered out too quickly, and they're clearly interested in having our students apply. And lastly, I'll just say that we have a couple of articles, if you're interested in reading more about the program, that you might want to look at. There was a Physics Today article in October 2019 that pretty much lays out in about 6 pages the details of what I said and what I just said in much more depth. So that's a good place to start if you want to know more. Obviously, the statistics in that article are now out of date, but you get the picture. And then we had an article in Nature Astronomy I wrote with Kelly, Holly Bockelman, and Julie Posselt about bridge programs in general, PhD bridge programs in general, which includes CalBridge, as well as the APS bridge, which a lot of physics departments are starting to work with, and the Fisk-Vanderbilt bridge program, which was sort of the first one that started it all, and the Columbia bridge program. So with that, I will conclude and say thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has. I'll leave the slides up for a minute in case somebody wants to see a slide, but thank you very much.
Yeah, Alex. We'll open to questions. So Ekta Patel, please. Would you like to unmute and ask?
Sure. I was interested in hearing more about the mentoring in the CalBridge program. So I often hear in academic settings that because there is this lack of representation of URMs in general, this obviously propagates up to the higher career stages, which means that there might not be enough mentor support to support students like the ones that are in the CalBridge program. So I'm wondering how you overcome that and what type of mentorship training is provided to your mentors so that they can, effectively support students who hold different identities than maybe those of the students.
Right. That's a great question. So the answer, of course, is we don't obviously have enough mentors of the identities of our students, but we do have, I think, a pretty good number. I think it was 250 who are. So there's a lot of faculty who want to try. So there are ways. I mean, clearly there are ways for non-minority, non-women mentors to be mentors to someone who's not of their identity, even though it would be better if they were. We started off without doing a whole lot of training because we didn't have a lot of resources to provide training. And so we just kind of hoped for the best. But we have started this year. We just had a workshop. So I should mention, just of general interest, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine just put out a report on the science of mentoring. It's easy to find if you just Google that. It's on their website. It's free to download. And they have a really nice resource page that's very easy to navigate to get resources from to help you with this topic. And they talk about everything to do with mentoring, not just identity, but they do have a large section on identity and how people of different identities can do better jobs of mentoring someone who's not of their identity. We had that available to all mentors to attend this past, just like a week ago. They did a fairly quick overview, but there's a lot of material out there to help with this. But you're right, mentor training is one of the big things that we talk about in the AAS report as well. It's one of the most important things that's not happening enough. People are very wary of workshops and training, right? In some ways, it's probably better to call it professional development than training, because really it's not about, faculty don't like to go to trainings, but they might be interested in having professional development. So we do have some training for our mentors to try to help them with these things, but some of them just like in academia in general, there's not enough training for this as there should be. I will say that we have had pretty positive feedback about the mentoring, because I think goodwill does carry you a pretty long way. And we do provide a lot of guidance about what mentors should be doing. So I should say that we actually wrote a mentoring handbook that we've been giving out to our mentors for a while now. And we're actually having it rewritten by a group of scholars to turn it into a handbook for mentors and mentees from a scholar perspective. So it's going to include a lot of things that scholars think are important. And these are senior scholars who are in grad school. Actually, these are people who've been through the program and are now in PhD programs who are bringing their perspective to that topic. So we hope that will eventually be available if people wanted to see it. Certainly, if you're in the program, you'll see it.
Thanks for the question and answer. Sherwood, could you ask next?
Yeah, thanks for the fantastic talk. I was curious about, so you had a slide where you had some pie charts showing outcomes, and I don't know what these numbers look like in general. So would you be able to put in context, and like, how does this compare to non-CalBridge students?
Well, I can only speak, I don't have data side by side with the same population, but in general, underrepresented minority STEM students who receive a bachelor's, about 2% go on for PhDs. Whereas we have about 90% that we hope will eventually get the PhD. So that's some idea of the difference. But I don't have a control group that I can say. I mean, I can tell you from my experience, and this is anecdotal, right? But my sense from from my department is that maybe about 25% might go on for PhDs in the past. Certainly we are selecting for students who are motivated, so that's part of what we're doing. But I will say that the students themselves will tell you how important the program was to them to doing what they're doing. That is, and in fact, I would recommend, if anybody wants, I should have mentioned, we have a YouTube channel, which is, if you just search for Cal-Bridge, make sure you do the dash, and then YouTube, you'll find it. We have a series we call Scholar Voices, where we've interviewed the scholars to talk about their experiences, and they talk about all the things that made a difference and how they don't think they would have made it through to this point without this program. So it's not numerical, but it's very important related to the fact that we think that what we're doing is extremely impactful.
All right, great, thank you so much.
Any more questions?
There's a few hands raised.
Oh, I didn't see it. Elizabeth, if you want to call them out.
Yeah. Andrea Ann.
Hey there. Thank you for your talk and all the work that you've been doing with CalBridge. I was wondering if you could speak briefly about, you mentioned extending the program to involve community colleges and community college students.
Right.
And what kind of programs are happening in that area?
So there's two ways that community colleges are involved. From a very early stage, the Comparative Summer Research Program was originally for CSU students. In fact, it started as a program just for Cal Poly Pomona, my home school, and then grew over time to include all the CSUs. But for a long time, we've allowed community college students to be involved in the summer research program. So, for example, next summer, if Berkeley is part of the Compare network, then you will get applicants from community college who are still in community college who will apply to work for you in the summer, along with Cal State students from across the state. So we have ways for community college students to get engaged in research early, which has been shown by a lot of research to be a very big factor in motivating students to go to finish their degree, let alone go on for PhDs. In addition, at the same time that we recruit them to join the summer program, we also actively recruit them to transfer to a CSU to join the CalBridge program. Now, obviously, a lot of community college students go to UCs as well, but if they're interested in this program, they would transfer to one of the CSUs, and we know that's happening. And they often hear about it from somebody giving a talk to them. In fact, we're doing a large. This summer there was the Strike for Black Lives, which maybe some of you participated in, and CalBridge had a number of meetings on that day to talk about ways that the entire community could get involved in fighting racism and anti-Black racism. And one of the outcomes was a group of scholars, alums again, who are in PhD programs, volunteered to take over our recruiting, particularly at community colleges. So they're starting to go out and give talks virtually, obviously, to both CSU students and community college students about both Compare and CalBridge to get them interested. So the idea is we want to let them know early, so if they decide they want to go on for a PhD, they can, tailor their program as a community college student towards transferring to a CSU and then getting into the program. Those are the two main things we're doing right now with the community colleges.
Thank you. Katie, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk, Professor Rudolph. I really appreciated your graphic that difference in the ideas of equality versus equity versus social justice. And I'm wondering what you think are in this analogy, and especially what is the fence and how do we break it down?
Wow, that's a big question. And I should just say, I'm not an expert. I consider myself someone who believes in social justice and equity, but I'm not, there are people who've devoted their entire lives to that as a broad topic. So I'll just give you my personal perspective. I think I've come to think that there are societal level barriers. Like I mentioned, school is one of them. The fact that we have such uneven school funding for schools, housing, redlining, and the ways that in some ways, redlining and the way we've sort of created ghettos and shepherded people into sort of lower income kind of settings kind of feeds into all of these. So it feeds into the fact that there's going to be less money for schools to be good. So there's not that way out. Policing is another one, of course, that we're all aware of. That's become a big topic. The fact that that Black people in particular face different problems with police. But even the fact that if you're in a poorer neighborhood, that just brings a lot of police presence, which just creates a cycle of, of keeping that the way it is. So things like that are clearly important. The message I like to give, though, is that just because, some people will say, well, how can we fix a problem? Like when I first started doing this work, why would you even think about PhDs when there's problems at the kindergarten through 12 level? And really, if you don't solve the problem at the beginning, then what are you going to really do? And I was even told there just aren't enough underrepresented students who could go to PhD programs to even do a program like this, right? That's one reason people used to believe there weren't enough students applying, is they just weren't there. There weren't qualified students. And I wanted to go out and try to prove that's not true, and I think we have. It's not that there aren't qualified students who are from underrepresented minority groups already in college, who've made it through whatever barriers they had to get there. They just need help getting to that next stage, just like they're going to need help as PhD students to continue on this whole retention thing. So although the things I mentioned sound like big, broad societal things that we do have to fight for sure, and that's the fence, basically, is what I would say. I think we can still maybe fight for the extra box, if you will, in the middle picture by doing things like CalBridge and focusing on trying to help, students who've made it to this point succeed. Does that answer your question?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Gwen, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, thanks. I really enjoyed this talk. I'm a graduate student here now, and I'm wondering, like, how can we help? We participate?
Well, first of all, I'm going to be meeting with any students who are interested tomorrow at 4:30, so we can talk a lot more about that there. But we've been working on trying to find more ways for grad students at the UCs to be part of this. One thing that we're doing is we have created a peer mentoring program, which is primarily meant to be between CalBridge scholars, but also does include people who are at the UCs who might be available to help peer mentor students in the program. I will say for sure that if you are able to get some CalBridge scholars, there are currently no CalBridge scholars at Berkeley, either physics or astronomy. I hope that's going to change soon. But once they do come, of course, you can welcome them in and make them feel included and make them part of your group and do the things that can be helpful to make them succeed. But the peer mentoring program is probably the other biggest area. So if you come to the thing tomorrow, I'll try to talk about that a little bit, and I can definitely put people in touch with the director of that program is actually a grad student at UC Irvine, who's been running it for this is only our second year of running the peer mentoring program. And I think we have had grad students who are non-CalBridge grad students at the UCs get involved in helping be peer mentors.
Thanks.
Any more questions? So let me see. I don't see anything either in the chat or any hands raised, in which case I'll go myself. So Alex, we have, first, thank you very much for, I said many thanks for all the wonderful work that you're doing, and for this talk as well, and meeting with our students tomorrow and with the admissions committee. And I wanted to ask, we are planning 2 events, which are graduate diversity fairs hopefully to attract people to apply to our program. And I was wondering if you can give us advice on what would scholars want to see in such short fairs that would be most meaningful.
Well, I think that they're going to be looking, they'll obviously want, just to address the graduate student question in a different way, I think a grad student can play a very big role in recruiting students. Now they have to believe in what's going on in the program, and that's, sometimes the issue is if there's not a good, sometimes programs that have trouble promoting diversity are not doing a good job for their underrepresented students. And the students who are there will let people know, which they should, because we don't want our students to go places they won't be supported. So if you could flip that script around and be like, look, if you do a good job by your current grad students, especially the underrepresented students, then they will become ambassadors for you. And that's one thing, is giving them a chance to interact with those grad students who can tell them and encourage them to be honest about what's good and what's bad. I think what I'm hearing is that I don't know your statistics. I'm guessing they're not where you want them to be or where you hope they would be. I suspect that, but you seem to be making efforts, right? You're doing a climate survey, and as I say, I really strongly encourage you to look at the AAS report and read about the process. We basically laid out a process for departments to kind of do a self-analysis and think about these issues about inclusion, which is the same related to intent. Kind of the point you're getting at is, I guess what I'd say is that CalBridge scholars and students of underrepresented groups in general, and all grad students really should care. They want to see that you're committed to inclusion and helping them stay, not weeding them out or trying to get, trying to only take the best of the best, whatever that would mean. So if you're showing them, even if you aren't 100% there, if you're showing them that you're moving in that direction, that will become a thing that they will respond positively to, I would say.
Thank you. Let me see if there are any more questions.
I see a question in the chat real quickly about from someone named Allison. Do you want to, should I just read it, or do you want to say it? Does she want to say it out loud? She was asking, I was wondering what you feel is the best way to hold faculty administration accountable for their failings. I find it very frustrating as an undergraduate to have the onus put on us to make departments more diverse. I think that mentorship, while important, is the least commitment and that more should be done. I agree. I think that mentorship, although I think mentorship can be a bigger commitment than you think. So committing to something like CalBridge can be actually a pretty significant commitment. It's a multi-year thing with meeting every other week, really spending time with a student to get to know them and help them. Obviously a PhD mentor does a lot more than that as well. It's a problem at the undergrad level. And I at the same time, as a faculty member, I have to be sympathetic to the fact that we're all overworked and overstressed. So I think that the best thing, I don't know about holding them accountable, but I certainly think that I would say to all the faculty to recognize that you are the ones who need to make the change, and particularly those who are not from minority groups. I mean, those of us who are in the majority, it's on us to really make change happen. Listening very closely to our colleagues, both faculty and grad students and undergrads who are of minoritized groups, listening carefully to what they tell us and what the literature and what's known, but taking the lead and taking the risk and putting ourselves out there and committing some of our political and social capital towards making real change. It's not going to really happen unless we do. So, this whole thing in the AAS task force report is about trying to get at least a very large plurality, if not a majority or a significant majority of your faculty behind seriously trying to make change and working at it. And it does take time and effort.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you, Alex. Are there any more questions? So I don't see anything. Please yell if I missed your question. And for the graduate students, you'll have another chance to ask questions tomorrow at 4:30. If there are no more questions, let me thank Alex again.
And if any faculty want to talk privately, just send me an email. I'm easy to find. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm really impressed by the turnout, and I hope it stimulates some good conversations in your department.